What do you do with a game cartridge that looks like this? You play it on your Super Nintendo. Better than a regular Nintendo. It's Super. I like the title. See, I was always a Genesis guy back in the day, in the 16-bit era, and I love the Sega Genesis. It's stylish, it's sleek, it's got hundreds of schlock science fiction games that I like, but this one cuts to the chase. Super Nintendo. There's no question as to what this is. You play super versions of Nintendo games like Mario Brothers and Metroid, and Super Mario Kart. It's the Super Nintendo. And just in case you don't believe me, it says right there, Super Nintendo. I think that Super should have been 5 times bigger. This was released in 1991 in the United States, and it's like typical Nintendo style. It's not terribly attractive, but it works really well. In fact, I think the Super Nintendo would get the award for the most unattractive game console that works well, because it's terrific. But it looks weird. I mean, I don't really know where they were going with this. Giant purple buttons, and it has the eject thing that throws the game up and then drops it down. Maybe that was part of their plan. If it throws the game high enough and drops it down and breaks it, you'll have to buy another one. I've previously reviewed the Super Nintendo gamepad, and this has really grown on me the more time that I've spent playing Super Nintendo games. It's very comfortable, a bit small for my hands these days. I prefer the larger gamepads like the Sega Genesis gamepad, but the Super Nintendo gamepad just seems to work well. And many of the games on the Super Nintendo are platformers or old school arcade style action games, and this just has a nice solid responsive D-pad, 4 buttons, and the ones on top here sometimes can get a bit frustrating because of the size. That's why I like a larger gamepad. Even that Nakatech Super Nintendo / Sega Genesis gamepad is better for using the top buttons, but for overall general use in games like Yoshi's Island, this works well. The Super Nintendo has many strengths, like its build quality, its simplicity, its ease of use, the fact that it shares the same AV cables as the N64, but most importantly, its massive library of incredible games like Star Fox, Super Mario Kart, that's a good one, Super Metroid, Super Mario World, thanks to Christian in the Netherlands for that game, Doom with the giant angry red cartridge, and Ultraman. I'll say this for it, even though I don't care for the styling of the Super Nintendo, it feels like it's well constructed, and the fact that this model works flawlessly, I think speaks to that effect. Let's look at how you insert a video game. We'll go with Super Mario World here. You put it in to the cartridge slot and push down. You're good to go. Then you turn on the power. It would light up if this was plugged in, and you play it. It's just that simple. And most of the Super Nintendo games are massive games, at least the ones produced by Nintendo. They gave you a lot of bang for your buck back then, with video games that took months to play, or at least weeks if you were really good and had a lot of time. But some of these are just giant games. The Super Nintendo is relatively easy to collect for these days, although many of the games still hold their value. That's how popular they were, and that's how many people are still playing Super Nintendo, or at least that's how many people are still reliving their past. And one of the things that I like most about the Super Nintendo, in addition to the build quality and the library of games, is that it reminds me of an era when game consoles were actually different. The Super Nintendo's primary competitor was the Sega Genesis. This is the smaller Sega Genesis Model 3. Really the competitor was the Model 1 or the Model 2, but this one fits in the shot nicer. So I'm going to just use the Model 3 as my example. Because frankly, these two hate each other, and the moment I stop filming, they're going to pick a fight. And the only thing that will stop it is the Vectrex. I love that there's a phone number on the back featuring Mario with a screwdriver. That's somewhat misleading because if I call this number, I would expect Mario to show up with a screwdriver, giving me Nintendo world-class service. We've got a silver plate down here telling you it's a Super Nintendo control deck, serial number, and here's where the audio-video cables would go, and it has an RF out if you were going to use that back in the day. This is where your AC power adapter would go, and this is where the flames shoot out when it gets really hot. I brought in some crowd control under the watchful eye of the Vectrex. I'll continue the review. The thing with the Super Nintendo versus the Genesis is that they are different. Literally different game consoles. They had a different library of games. For the most part, there were some titles that were released on both systems, but the majority of games were unique to the Genesis or the Super Nintendo. And the Super Nintendo games, like Yoshi's Island and Super Metroid, look completely different than Sega Genesis games. They sound different. They were really different game systems. Subterranea, for the Sega Genesis, looks nothing like Yoshi's Island. Now, they're somewhat different games. This is more typical of what I like to think of from the Sega Genesis: spaceship shooting games, science fiction games, whereas the Super Nintendo is the game for these massive, the game console for these massive Nintendo adventures, like the Zelda games and the Mario Brothers games. So if you grew up with the Super Nintendo, you're going to prefer the Super Nintendo. If you grew up with the Genesis, you'll prefer the Genesis. If you did not grow up with either, then you can buy a Nintendo Wii and use the Virtual Console to download Nintendo and Genesis games. You should find out for yourself what you prefer. Not that it really matters these days, because they're both relatively easy to collect for and affordable. Except for some of these Nintendo games. They really do hold their value. I'm not going to get into the Super Nintendo versus the Vectrex, because frankly, that would just take too long to even explain. Now that we're all friends and these two game consoles are holding hands in the Nintendo Wii Virtual Console, it's time to try something. Let's see, let's take out that game. Alright, that works. There we go. That's special! For some reason this just won't work though. I'm gonna try to move it over. How about that? No? Does that work? No. How about... No. Let's try something else. If that doesn't work, let's go with that. That seems to fit perfectly.